Welcome to Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer from the Department of Sociology at Western Michigan University, and I serve as the host of our program. With me today are our two regular viewmeisters, commentators. On my far right over here is Regena Nelson. Regena is from the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Educational Studies at Western Michigan University. Always a mouthful to say. Don Cooney is from the School of Social Work at Western Michigan University, and he also dabbles in politics a little bit, and he's a Kalamazoo City Commissioner, currently the Vice Mayor of Kalamazoo. Yes. And we have two very special guests with us today. We're going to be talking about a very important project that's going on, actually all around the country this summer and fall. With me on the right is Helen Jaccard. Did I say your name right? She's with an organization called Veterans for Peace, and she is the Golden Rule Peace Boat Project Manager, right?
That's right.
Okay, and on my left is Denise Duffield, who is an Associate Director with the Physicians for Social Responsibility in Los Angeles. Well, she's currently back in her home area, which is the Kalamazoo area, so it's good to have both of you with us today.
Thank you.
So, the Golden Rule Peace Boat has a long history, and then there's this special project now. It's been resurrected, and it's now back with a special project. So, Helen, why don't you fill us in on the history of this boat and your current project?
Thanks, I'd be happy to. So from 1946, right after World War II ended, to 1958, the United States used 67 nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands. You go from California to Hawaii, 2,000 miles, and another 2,000 miles into the Pacific is where the Marshall Islands are, Bikini Atoll and Awaitak Atoll. And these nuclear explosions produce elements that don't exist in nature. The most important one at the time is strontium-90, and the problem is it acts like calcium. So it displaces calcium in your body. Particularly, it was getting into babies' teeth and bones and mother's milk and cow's milk. So women were testing their milk for radiation before they would feed it to their babies. People were trying to get this contamination stopped, and even though they tried contacting Congress and the president and general public demonstrated in the streets, nothing was happening. Mm-hmm. So this group of Quakers bought this small sailboat and with the intention of sailing right into the nuclear testing zone. And when they got to Honolulu, resupplied and headed out there, the Coast Guard brought them back and arrested the crew. But the arrest of the crew brought about such a huge public backlash and an increase in the anti-nuclear testing sentiment at the time, and that gave, only 5 years later, President Kennedy signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty with the UK and the USSR. And this little boat inspired the founding of Greenpeace, whose first mission was to do the same, only for underground nuclear testing. Mm-hmm. Now, the captain was a veteran for peace in that Albert Bigelow had quit his Navy commission, 30 years in the Navy. He'd been at Pearl Harbor when the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he quit his commission a month before he could have retired with full pay out of protest to the dropping of those bombs. Because he knew those bombs were falling on civilians, and he knew that a couple 100,000 people had died instantly. Mm-hmm. So anyway, in 1958, they sold the boat, and it was in private hands until 2010. She sank in a gale in far northern California, and Veterans for Peace and Quakers and other wooden boat lovers spent 5 years restoring the Golden Rule. So we launched in June of 2015 and went up and down the West Coast for 5 years, then around the Hawaiian Islands, because we were trying to get back to the Marshall Islands where we were trying to head in 1958.
Try to complete the mission.
That's right. Well,
the original mission.
The problem was when we were ready to leave the Hawaiian Islands, it was March of 2020. Yeah. And COVID shut us down. Oh. So we brought the Golden Rule back to California and thought about, well, what should we do next? And so we'd heard about this boaters thing. It's called the Great Loop. And what we did isn't quite a loop, partly because when we start in Minneapolis, there's no way to loop around in from the north. Can't get down there from Lake Superior. But anyway, we started in Minneapolis, went through the center of the country, around the tip of Florida, visited Cuba so we could talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the similarities between that and what's going on in Ukraine. Worked our way up the whole East Coast and then through the Great Lakes, and here we are. Well, the boat's in Racine and soon to head for Chicago. I had to come to Kalamazoo without the boat because of strong winds through the lake, and then we'll end up in Chicago with our final events.
You had hoped to dock in St. Joseph, Michigan.
We did.
And have some events. The events are still going to go on.
All the events are going on, except the boat tours will have to, some people have to drive over to Chicago to see her.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're making this loop, and so this is originally a protest boat, but it's
Yes.
operating more now as a kind of educational.
That's correct.
On an educational mission, right?
It is an educational mission. So when we get to a port of call, oftentimes waiting for us is the mayor to welcome us. That alone is a piece of education because the proclamations of welcome talk about the history of the Golden Rule and the fact that we are in more danger today of nuclear exchange, nuclear war, than even maybe during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so they acknowledge the need to eliminate nuclear weapons, and they very often proclaim that they're in favor of the new United Nations Treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, the last of the weapons of mass destruction to be made internationally illegal. And then we'll often have an indigenous welcome, a brass band like we'll have here. And so we educate people about the United Nations Treaty, and Denise will talk about the back from the brink measures to bring us back from the brink of nuclear war. And we talk about what you can do locally to support getting rid of nuclear weapons. Like, what if we had some demonstrations in front of the banks that fund nuclear weapons? Or if you have nuclear weapons facilities near you, you could have demonstrations. You could show up at the manufacturing plants, shareholders meetings, and cause a little bit of good trouble. So we can advocate for protests if people choose that sort of method. You can advocate for a couple of the measures that are in the House of Representatives. I believe Denise will be talking about those as well. And you can get your city or your pension fund to divest from nuclear weapons. So there's a lot of actions that people can take to strengthen their voice to eliminate nuclear weapons.
And local action, that's one of the things you have been talking about and promoting, right? In your work with Physicians for Social Responsibility and Back from the Brink?
Yes. So the Back from the Brink, it's Back from the Brink, bringing communities together to abolish nuclear weapons, is a coalition running a multi-year campaign. We were founded at the end of 2017 when the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was adopted as a way to start to build support for it locally here in the United States. It was Physicians for Social Responsibility and the Union of Concerned Scientists that initially conceived of the campaign, but the campaign really is meant not to be owned by any one individual or group. We have a set of policy solutions. The first and the most important is asking the U.S. to lead an effort among a multilateral agreement with nuclear armed states to completely eliminate their arsenals. Also, that there should be a no first use policy. The United States should declare that it will not use a nuclear weapon first. It's a very low moral bar, but we haven't been able to get over that one.
Right.
Also that the president should not have sole unrestricted authority to launch a nuclear weapon. There are also bills in Congress right now around that. And that removing nuclear weapons from hair trigger alert, and then finally canceling the plan to basically modernize or rebuild our entire nuclear arsenal. And so around this we call them the common sense policy solutions, we're really engaging with local communities. Another big point of the campaign is that nuclear weapons policy often feels untouchable. Like people don't think there's anything they can do about that. And so we're really working to make it so that anybody, any individual, any elected official, any organization has agency and can get involved in this campaign. And a lot of it has been built around local resolutions, cities throughout the country, towns, counties, states, adopting resolutions in support of these policies. And it really serves as an organizing tool for organizers. You begin by looking at other groups in your community. That helps us break out of our silo. Right now, the nuclear disarmament space is small, it's older, it's way too light. And by doing a community-based approach, you're reaching out to other groups and you're finding common cause. We can talk about why nuclear weapons are an environmental justice issue, a racial justice issue, how it intersects with climate, and really begin to sort of build out a more visible constituency for nuclear disarmament. And we're having success. We have a past, and I have a background as a local organizer around a contaminated site in Los Angeles, the Santa Susana Field Lab. So so this model makes sense to me. Before this, we'd go and we'd give talks about the dangers of nuclear weapons and policy solutions, but we couldn't really give people something meaningful to do afterwards. Sign a petition. This, you can roll up your sleeves and get involved. So the city of Los Angeles adopted a resolution, Baltimore, Chicago, Washington, D.C., Honolulu, Salt Lake City, Tucson, Boston. I don't know if I said Boston already. Big cities, but also in smaller cities. And we just had one yesterday, New Haven, Connecticut. Last month, South Salt Lake, Utah. And so then you start to build some momentum there, and folks get to know their elected officials. And we have also support from over 460 diverse organizations, over 320 or more local and state elected officials. We have civic leaders and experts that have endorsed the campaign, and that's what we're doing. We're building power from the ground up. The other thing about why I think local activism is so important is that ultimately all of these resolutions are meant to influence federal policy. Every resolution that's passed is sent on to the congressional delegation for that city or town, or state, in the case of California and Oregon. And they need to know that there are people in their district, real people, leaders, organizations, all kinds of organizations, environmental groups, veterans groups, students groups, elected officials, and of course cities and counties in their district that are saying, we want you to stand up, we want you to take action. And when we do that, it becomes a lot different. And for some of them, they want to take action, but they actually need cover. They need to say, my constituents are pushing me to do this. I'm going to co-sponsor this bill because I'm hearing it from my constituents. And sometimes we find out they don't know as much about nuclear weapons as we do. There was a very prominent member of Congress we spoke to a few weeks ago who didn't realize we don't have a no first use policy. So it's just
something pretty basic.
Yeah, something pretty basic.
U.S. policy, right?
Yeah. So we're continuing to build the support locally and then demonstrate that support in an attempt to, number one, abolish nuclear weapons, and particularly now at this time of war, it's a cause I hope everybody will engage in.
Well, we have a community organizing expert right here. I'm sure he wants to chip in and talk about the importance of that strategy.
I think it's great. I have a number of questions to ask you. First of all, you mentioned that there were some bills in Congress right now. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yes. The HRS 77 is the bill that Back from the Brink is really focused on. There's another one which we'll talk about in a moment. And HRS 77 essentially mirrors all of these local resolutions. So it's a very powerful way to then, I'll go talk to your congressman and say, these cities in your district adopted these same policies. There's a little bit of a difference with HRS 77 in that it's a little more detailed on the agreement to eliminate nuclear arsenals. It specifically calls out the need for an agreement with the Russian Federation before 2026, the end of the START agreement.
So the only remaining weapons treaty that we have is the New START treaty, and it's set to expire in 2026.
That's right. So HRS 77 specifies that, and it too has become an organizing tool and a way to build champions in Congress, because I wasn't involved in the 80s. I was going to high school here at Madawan High School, but there was a freeze movement happening then, and that movement also made a great deal of these of local resolutions. And so in some ways, it's borrowing that strategy. And I would say with mayors, Mayors for Peace is another campaign that we work closely with, and a lot of the cities that are adopting these resolutions are also Mayors for Peace cities. So right now, HRS 77 has 36 co-sponsors, which is good for a nuclear weapons bill. The other resolution I don't is 2775. That's Eleanor Norton Holmes' bill. She has been introducing this bill, I think, since '94 for a long time, 16 years, and it's basically calling for nuclear weapons to be eliminated, for the U.S. to, once the other countries have signed, have also agreed to eliminate their weapons, to join onto the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and redirect those funds towards addressing climate and addressing, human health and security and education. So those two, and both of those bills, by the way, have, she's the lead on that. Congressman McGovern from Massachusetts is also with that. He and Ed Blumenthal from Oregon were the co-sponsors of HRS 77.
So if you want to do anything at the local level, my experience is they're going to say, yeah, that's great, but that's the federal government's job. That's not our job.
Yes.
So we got violence in the city. We got people that are homeless. Don't talk to me about this stuff. So we're getting past that, though. We're getting past that. We've had people say that, and one of the mayor of Portland, I think, said, people have been telling us that it's our job. It's my job to take care of the city, but there's not going to be a city for me to take care of if we don't deal with this issue, and we will be on the front lines should something happen. So we had one of my favorite responses was. I don't support these feel-good resolutions. So we're like this feels good. But yes, we have heard that before, and we've, by the time we get a resolution introduced, we've had conversations with folks. We have a sense of where it's going to go. We have people meet with their members. So there have been a couple of times where that hasn't worked out, but by and large, by the time a resolution comes up for a vote, we've done all of that work, but we have certainly heard that plenty of times. So I think, though, in your literature, I think you can tie it locally by talking about the economic impact.
Right.
That's right.
In your literature, it says that nuclear weapons are costing us $2 million an hour.
It's probably greater than that now, yes.
It's greater than that now.
Right.
That's money that we could be using locally. I didn't see in your literature, maybe you could say something about it now, about how you tie nuclear weapons to the racial issue.
I will talk about that. First, just on the cost issue, I wanted to say that our board president, Dr. Bob Dodge, has, for over 40 years on tax day, calculated the amount of money that cities spend on nuclear weapons in their tax dollars. And so it's on our website, psr-la.org/nuclear costs, and that's our community cost projects, and we will calculate for any city. So a lot of these resolutions are customized to that city and say, the city of Los Angeles spends this, it's one of the whereases. On the racial justice issue, we have been, again, looking to break out of our silos. Last year, we partnered with the Poor People's Campaign, March for Survival in Washington, D.C., and really brought a lot of other peace and disarmament groups in there, recognizing that nuclear weapons are a moral issue. We also can talk about the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons testing on communities of color. And of nuclear weapons production. We can talk about Savannah River Plant. We have communities impacted there. We talk about also gender impacts, the greater impact on women and girls from radiation. And I think another strong message that resonates is talking about what we really need to be safe, what we need for human security. Some of the state violence, whether it's on the police on our streets, bullying people with weapons, with military weapons or weapons of war, or it's the nuclear weapon states bullying other countries. There is a link as well. So talking about a new vision for what true human security looks like, and pulling in a lot of issues that disproportionately impact communities of color, has been a very strong message, and we are seeing more and more progress. All kinds of different groups are endorsing the organization. But we have a long, long way to go.
Right.
A long way to go. And that's why I like the local elections. We've had people in Philadelphia that when they passed their resolutions, they had signs saying end white supremacy and abolish nuclear weapons. Black Lives Matters and other racial justice groups have endorsed local resolutions in their community. So I think this is a values discussion as well. And when we talk about those things, and we find that we are causing more of a united voice on this issue, and also to be there for other folks as well. So we're building just community social change power as well. If we work with a group on a resolution on nuclear weapons, and they've got another agenda on the city council item, two agenda items later, we're going to stay there and we're going to support that, whether it's about housing or environment or anything.
Well, I'd like to point out more about the racial issue, which is, who was it that was bombed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Brown people. Who was it that was tested on in both Nevada and the Marshall Islands? Brown people. Who is it that lives on uranium-rich land? Indigenous peoples, both here and in the rest of the world. So who has been harmed so much already is primarily people of color, if you take a look at a global perspective. Also, as we were kind of talking about it, I want to really emphasize that the money that's being put into nuclear weapons would really, really benefit people of color, probably more than anybody else, because that's what we want, the things that everybody needs, but especially that people of color often don't get, food and housing and medical care and education. We could use a lot of, we could really provide for people much better if this money wasn't going into nuclear weapons.
I agree, but I think you will get pushback from politicians who will say, the manufacturing of these weapons, there's jobs, there are contracts that fund their campaigns, and so they're going to stay away from this. How do you counter that argument?
Well, for one thing, if we had good jobs that were for cleaning up the nuclear mess, and we were converting our factories to make life-affirming products, everybody could get behind that. So why is the United States providing just a few people with all this money to then turn around and beat lobby?
In the climate justice movement, we talk about a just transition, and there can be a just transition for nuclear weapons too. And along the lines that Helen was talking about, it is interesting talking to. They don't usually come out and say that. I got jobs in my district,
but we know.
But we know what the reason is. Nevertheless, if we build enough power, if there are enough people, and we have retired military that support us. Former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry went to his city council meeting via Zoom, because it was COVID, in Atherton, California, and testified. and it was the most amazing thing, because they're just like next on the agenda. You know how these things go, Mr. Bill Perry, and there he was. So we have, if we build enough power, we then hold the key to their jobs. They're called representatives because they represent us. So that's what we're trying to do. It's slow going. There's a lack of capacity, a lack of funding for this work, which is really really impacts the space in numerous ways. But we are determined to do that, and that's where I think where we would come up against that is if it comes down to it, if there's enough people in that community that are going to decide whether you keep your job or not. Then perhaps the other arguments recede a bit.
Yeah, that's helpful to know that there are models out there to counter that argument.
But what Regina's bringing up is really the power of the military-industrial complex, right?
That's true.
President Eisenhower warned about the influence of the military-industrial complex when he left the presidency in 1961. And it is the fact that, and actually we should call it the military-industrial congressional complex, because the congressional side is just as important. They're the ones that provide the money. But yes, it is that, and it's a very deliberate pattern to locate defense contracts in different congressional districts to build in support, to lure in, to in a sense, to bribe Congress people so that they feel like, oh, if I speak out against this and we lose the defense plan in my area, then I'm going to lose my job. And so it's a very clever tactic on the part of the military-industrial complex to build in that kind of support. So that makes it even more difficult for those of us who are doing this kind of work to counteract that enormous influence that's already out there.
So the only way to combat that is to get people involved.
People
That's
power.
right. Two kinds of power: money power and people power.
That's right.
And I think organizers always make a distinction between problems and issues. We got thousands of problems. How do they become issues? An issue is a problem that we want to do something about. How do we get this? And that's what you guys are doing, is you're making this an issue. And by raising the consciousness of people and going to communities, as you said, it's not going to work if you go to a city commission meeting and during public comments say, we want you to pass this resolution. No, that's not going to happen. What's got to happen is a grassroots movement where we begin to talk to people and raise this issue and educate people and build a constituency that then comes to the city commission and says, hey, this is so important, we got to do something
That's
about
right,
it.
and that's why we have over 80 cities on board now, and again in some states too, in some counties. But it's that pre-work, that building the coalition, again, and breaking out of our silos, talking to other folks. And I think one thing that Back from the Brink and Golden Rule also have in common is sort of baked into what we do is talking to people who aren't us. Because there's a lot of times we hold webinars for the people that come, we're preaching to the converted as people who are already good, but we're going out there and talking to people who aren't knowledgeable about this issue, who aren't aware of it. And that, I think, is key.
That's
As the
hard.
Golden Rule, we interact with a lot of mariners. We give talks at yacht clubs, for example, and Rotary clubs, places where you wouldn't expect that to be part of the conversation, and we are welcomed. People need hope. People don't want to wake up in the morning and think, wow, I could easily die of either climate change or a nuclear war. No, they don't want that. They want to know that some people are working on this and that they can help, and we give them hope through ways that they can take action.
Yeah.
Yeah. Denise, you mentioned the nuclear weapons freeze movement from the 1980s, and I think that's a really important model to talk about, because when Ronald Reagan became president and started a much more belligerent foreign policy and was rattling the nuclear saber, and the Cold War intensified at that point, and we had a huge arms buildup that was underway. But people responded. They mobilized. The nuclear weapons freeze, had its origins. It was a very simple idea that Randy Forsberg had. Just stop right now, freeze, don't build any more, as a first step. And that just caught on and like wildfire. And there are all kinds of resolutions passed in city commissions and state legislatures, and even in the halls of Congress.
Yeah.
Congress actually passed a watered down version of the freeze movement. But the main point I want to make is that it had an impact on Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
It really did. It
Yes.
really impacted him. And then when the opportunity came, when Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union, and he was also thinking along the same lines that we need to do something about that. And those two leaders, two unlikely people, but they came so close to abolishing nuclear weapons in 1986 at Reykjavik. I mean, if it wasn't for the stupid Star Wars thing, and it was stupid on both Reagan's part and Gorbachev's part, because it was a complete fantasy that Reagan had, and he wouldn't let go of it. And Gorbachev should have known better to say, okay, go ahead and build your stuff. His people later told him that's not going to happen, and he de-linked them later, so they were able to come up with a 1987 Intermediate Forces Agreement. And if they only could have done that at Reykjavik, we might have been well ahead. But the power of people in that movement. And June 12th, 1982, over 1 million people assembled in New York City.
We were there.
We were there.
Yay.
We marched up to Central Park, and the power of people getting in the street at that point, and it had a political impact, and that's the point. If people don't have hope, they need to see a model that, hey, people came together, they passed these resolutions, they organized, and they did have a political impact at that time, and that could happen again. That's what we need to let people know.
Can, and that is one of the other parts. Is used to doing, when you're doing a lot of federal advocacy, you're meeting with usually a staffer, and you'll be getting I'll let my boss know, I'll take this back. talking on the local, on the city level, on the county level, on the state level, you get a lot more nods. And actually, my favorite comment from one of the city councils in Massachusetts was, "Oh, this is a no-brainer."
Yeah.
And so what that does to you as an activist is it gives you a little energy. You know what I mean? It's like it's so used to walking out, no, no, no. We are often on this side of the political fence used to not being successful. When you start to have these, it puts a little wind in your sails, and then you want to go on and you want to do the other one, and it does, build up that sense that one city, one thing was like, well, why should my city matter? Why should my little town matter? But everyone makes a difference. Every organization that joins on makes a difference, and that's how you got to where they were in the freeze, where there were hundreds upon hundreds even in one state.
Yeah.
And when you talk about the actual result of that, which was that we went in this world from 80,000 nuclear weapons down to 13,000 we have today, that's huge. We've come over 75% of the way there.
That's right.
But we also have to talk about, the whole reason that the United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was able to pass, and that is the research that was done that said that 100, a very small percentage of what we have now, if 100 nuclear weapons was used, it would blow enough soot and ash from the resulting fires into the upper atmosphere to block out enough sunlight to produce some crop production that would ultimately starve to death 2 billion people.
That's right.
And that's why the TPNW was passed.
And our physicians in our organization worked on that study. It was the second one. It had to be revised. At first, it was 2 billion at risk, and it's going up. A global famine report. Absolutely, and one of the same doctors that worked on that, Dr. Ira Helfand, to your earlier point about the 50,000 nuclear weapons, I love when he says this. He's like, these weapons are not a force of nature. They were built with human hands, and we can take them apart, and we have. All that's missing is the political will to do so, and that is, I think, another a way to feel some agency is to see like this is not an entirely intractable problem. Technically it's easier in some ways to deal with this issue than the climate issue because we need energy. We don't need really nuclear weapons. Deterrence we know is a myth.
Yeah, the concept is nuclear winter that you were talking about, developed by Carl Sagan.
The small one is called nuclear autumn, but yes, nuclear winter, if you go far enough, we end up with the ice ball Earth model.
Yeah, but your point is it doesn't take an all-out exchange of nuclear weapons.
Correct.
A small exchange. If India and Pakistan, for example, engage in a dispute over water due to climate, becomes a resource war due to climate change, and it resorts to nuclear weapons, we could have then this huge environmental catastrophe called nuclear winter that Carl Sagan talked so much about back in the 1980s. And so there's clearly a linkage there, right? The use of nuclear weapons could cause climate disaster, but climate disaster can also lead to the use of nuclear weapons, right?
That's right.
So there's a clear nexus between these two issues that often gets overlooked, I think.
Yeah, and that global famine study is looking at 100 Hiroshima-sized bombs. We have much larger bombs now. And frankly, even this idea of a tactical nuclear weapon, I know researchers at Princeton did various models with this, and every single use of a nuclear weapon, tactical or not, ended up in full-scale nuclear war.
Yeah.
And even, I think it was the former Secretary of Defense Mattis had said there's no such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon. Once a nuclear weapon is used, it's an entire game changer. So.
Yeah, the idea
I could hope not.
The idea that nuclear weapons, tactical, the term tactical means that they're battlefield use, right?
Smaller.
In a more conventional type war, but yeah, I think it easily escalates or quickly escalates into something much larger. So.
Well, I think that we should also address nuclear policy. Right. The administrations, the presidents come out with a nuclear policy review. And the one that has been used for forever, as far as I know, says, yes, we will use nuclear weapons first. We will use them to defend ourselves and our allies against not just a nuclear strike, but a cyber attack and other kinds of attacks, and to protect U.S. interests. Well, what does that mean? The ability of the U.S. corporations to extract resources from the land of other countries. We will use nuclear weapons for that purpose. very aggressive. But Veterans for Peace put together
That's right.
a nuclear posture review of our own. It's full spectrum diplomacy and cooperation as opposed to full spectrum dominance, right? And what we did was we analyzed the relationship between the United States and the other nuclear armed countries and figured out there are opportunities all across the board to understand what the needs are of the other countries and the United States and come to agreements that will result in elimination and ultimate reduction and elimination of nuclear weapons. This gives me hope, because whether you're talking about North Korea, Russia, Iran is evaluated here, it can happen, but we just have to learn to listen. Our diplomats have to get the power to work on these treaties, and we have to back up our treaties with laws that say you can't just tear them up as one single individual, Mr. President, right?
Yep. I think that's this Veterans for Peace nuclear posture review was just a wonderful example too of like putting out an alternate message, but borrowing the same framework and taking advantage of this review that comes out at the beginning of every administration. Another nuclear policy is that we have that I think is another important talking point for talking to folks about abolishing nuclear weapons and how that seems so far away, is that the Non-Proliferation Treaty already requires the nuclear armed states to eliminate their arsenal. Article 6 says all states must work in good faith towards the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. And it's just been shined on. And every 5 years there's a review conference, and it ends dismally. And that's also what gave rise to the TPNW. It was like, we have to make this happen one way or the other. But President Biden released a statement ahead of this year's NPT review conference, and it again spoke about our ultimate goal of a world without nuclear weapons. So we are hearing a world without nuclear weapons is our ultimate goal, while we're passing ridiculous budgets to build new nuclear weapons.
Modernize and expand them.
Modernize. And so that's one of the things we talk about when we are meeting, particularly with Democrats, because they a lot of times take their nod from the administration, and the administration has come out and directly opposed to TPNW, is to remind them, President Biden said our goal is a world without nuclear weapons. If that is our goal, we've got to start working on it now. With these agreements take time, it's urgent, and like you said, START expires with the Russians, that treaty expires in 2026.
Well, and we also have to remind people of what China and Russia came out of the Beijing Olympics saying, right? The same thing you've heard before, a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. So the United States is not alone in declaring that nuclear weapons need to be eliminated. We just need to get the political will to do it, as you said.
Yeah, and I think it's really important for the United States has to lead, right?
Yes.
I mean, if we look at nuclear weapons, the whole story, we were the ones who developed the bomb, right? The Manhattan Project. Everybody's getting a taste of what that was about with the Oppenheimer movie this summer, right? We developed the weapon. We used the weapon. We're the only one to use the weapon in Japan in 1945. We were the ones who basically refused at that point to allow for international control of nuclear weapons after World War II. We then built the super bomb, the hydrogen bomb. Once the Soviet Union developed its own atomic weapons, then we upped the ante with developing the hydrogen bomb. So at every step of the process, the United States has taken the lead, and again has been the dominant power with regard to the international geopolitical system. So the United States is the one that has to take the lead. We're the one that has the power, the resources, the history, the responsibility to lead. But we won't lead because of the sort of American empire, imperialistic impulses that dominate the political scene, right? We won't take the steps that we need to. And that's where we come in terms of the political movements have to be the ones to pressure the government. We have to pressure President Obama went to Prague in
that's
2009 and said, you know, we're going to have a world without nuclear weapons.
Stayed up all night to watch it, got the goosebumps.
Yeah, that was so important at that time. And actually, you know, Obama was given the Nobel Peace Prize shortly after that, primarily because of that promise, the Prague promise. But of course, that was not a promise that was not fulfilled, right? And so we still have lots of work to do to pressure our own political administrations to put their money where their mouth is, right?
We do, and I just want to, before I forget, we have a new initiative. Speaking of U.S. leadership, I've talked about the U.S. has opposed the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, has opposed, you know, other countries even sending observers. We just launched yesterday a new initiative asking communities, our supporters, to work with their local and state and county local officials to have a sign-on letter to President Biden to send an observer to the second meeting of state parties for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. That is happening in New York the week after Thanksgiving. It's going to be a big deal. All the countries that are state parties to the treaty will have representatives there. Observers who are not part of the treaty, they can send. I understand that they often will make that decision at the last moment, so they don't have to deal with any pushback in their countries. And so it's a low bar, but it's another you know, idea where we're getting local voices in, again communicating that this is a local issue, and you know, trying to do all that we can. There's also members of Congress can also attend the Parliament's section of that, but for the U.S. to send an observer would be massively huge. Maybe people need to understand that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was passed by the United Nations General Assembly in 2017, and it has been now ratified by over 50 countries, and so it has gone into force, right? So this is now international law. However, the 9 nuclear weapons countries all boycotted this whole process, did not participate in any way, shape, or form, really actively resisted the creation of this treaty. But nonetheless, this treaty did pass. And because this treaty has now passed, it is international law that nuclear weapons are prohibited. One person who reviewing the treaty said, the only thing you can do with nuclear weapons under this treaty is get rid of them. You can't.
That's right.
You know, I mean, any aspect of the production and processing of nuclear weapons is forbidden, and so the only thing you can do is get rid of them. But of course, the 9 nuclear powers have resisted and are not going to do that. And so again, we're not a signatory to the treaty, but we could send an observer, and just in that step alone, you're saying, would be a step forward, because so far it's been all negative, it's been all resistance, and somehow we've got to break through that now to get the U.S., because in the end, that's what's going to have to happen. If the United States would break that logjam and say, we're gonna sign this treaty,
it'd be a game changer.
I mean, almost everybody else would have to follow at some point. And you know, that would be the game changer. But that's what has to happen. You know, the long history here, you mentioned the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That was signed in 1968, and it does legally obligate the nuclear powers. There were 5 at that point, and they were pledging that they would, if the rest of the world did not develop nuclear weapons, we would get rid of ours. That's a solemn legal obligation. And for over 50 years, we violated our solemn legal obligation to disarm.
And because of all of that, the Marshall Islands sued the 9 nuclear-armed nations in the International Criminal Court. Now, it didn't go anywhere, but at least everyone is acknowledging that aspect of the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
And the TPNW that has also, I think I think it's so important to talk about this. It includes provisions for environmental remediation and victim assistance for all of the contamination that's left behind from nuclear weapons tests and all the health impacts that those communities continue to suffer through generations.
And there's some good jobs for you. Remediation and then healthcare jobs for helping the victims. That's pretty good.
Yeah, it could be a just transition for nuclear weapons, just like we need to do for the fossil fuel industry.
Absolutely, yeah. Transition, I think, is the way that the legislators can ultimately work to make this happen, I think. Just say, we have better jobs available, let's do it, but let's do it right, because some of the work that's being done is not being done right as far as things like the decommissioning the nuclear power plants.
Yeah.
And the concept of military conversion has been around for a long time.
Sure.
I mean, you know, Seymour Melman was writing about this back in the early 70s, the notion of military conversion. And
Columbia.
So should we spend more than half of our income tax dollars on war and militarism? 800 U.S. military bases around the rest of the country, of the world.
Yeah.
What if there were 800 foreign military bases in our country, or encircling our country?
We wouldn't take to that too well, would we?
No, I think we should think about things, always flip them around and say, we're doing this, what if they did that to us, right?
The golden rule.
Oh, the golden rule, there you go.
Be a great name for a boat or something, right?
Yeah.
Good name for a boat. Yeah, that's great.
Should we talk about some of the events that are coming up?
Please.
All right, let's see. So, Saturday, we're going to be part of the Vintage in the Zoo Street Festival. We're going to have a table there. And after that, 6 p.m. is a concert for the Great Lakes at the Final Gravity
Brewing Company.
That's right. With some of my favorite people going to be there, including a brass band and one of my favorite musicians, Victor McManamy. And then Sunday we were going to have boat tours, but since the Golden Rule can't be there, then that's not going to happen. But Monday from noon till 5 and again from 6 to 8, we have teach-ins happening. And we're talking about the same things, right? What we're talking about this hour, each of those topics represents something that we're going to be talking about at our teach-ins. So noon to 5 is going to be at the
Martini's Pizza.
Thank you. And 6 to 8 is going to be at WMU Student Center, room 2414 in Ballroom A. You can get all this information, though, at vfpgoldenrule.org. So,
Now,
I should do
Check it
the Back from the Brink website too, which is preventnuclearwar.org.
Very good.
PreventNuclearWar.gov. Now, a lot of people aren't going to be watching this until after these events have taken place.
okay,
But
well.
I mean, I think
We were here.
what you're talking about is, I mean, maybe we'll get this up and some people will be able to watch it then the next day or two. But these are the kinds of things you've been doing everywhere that you go, right? And this
Yes.
is part of that larger educational campaign. It's going to happen here in Kalamazoo the next couple of days, even if people don't see this until after those events. But they should know that these are the kinds of things that you're doing with the Golden Rule.
Well, we try and have a
Project.
peace party in the park everywhere we go.
There you
And
go.
so that brings not just the peace activists and, us hippy-dippy kinds, but it brings out people walking by. They go, oh, what's this all about? And they learn something.
Yeah. So where do you go from here? So you're in Racine, Wisconsin right now. You'd hope to come to St. Joe. Next is Chicago?
Next is Chicago,
And then what?
September 12th to 19th. And then we're going to take the Golden Rule back up to Racine and take off the masts and strip them and put everything on a truck. We're going to take her back to her home port, Humboldt Bay, far northern California.
Wow.
Okay.
And we're talking about 2024 possibly being a trip up to the Pacific Northwest, where we haven't been since 2016. So we'll visit some of our old friends there.
Okay. So there's going to be, take it back to California for the winter, but then hopefully another phase next year.
Yeah, this isn't over, and we haven't decided what else we're going to do, but it makes sense for us to have a little bit lighter year, just go up to the Pacific Northwest and back, maybe a 4-month sailing season instead of a whole year like we've been on.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's impressive.
Going through this whole loop on the East Coast and up the Mississippi and
Yeah, so
the
we
Great
came
Lakes
down the
and-
Mississippi, around the tip of Florida, up the East Coast, and now around the Great Lakes, and it's an 11,000-mile voyage. We will have made at least 100 ports of call and probably 400 different events. And, we don't do it all by ourselves. There's 1,000 organizers out there, because there's probably at least a good 10 per city. And so this really invigorates people. It gets people working together that didn't work together before. so cool to see that happen, especially the Veterans for Peace chapters are now working within each other and working with a broader community than ever before. So I'm really happy with the effects that we're having on the peace and justice and anti-war, anti-nuclear communities.
Now, who did you connect with locally to organize this? What groups?
Oh,
for
well,
people who want to connect with those groups.
Right. So Physicians for Social Responsibility has been a major partner. World Beyond War, Code Pink, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and then local groups here like Beyond Nuclear. Kevin Camps is our main organizer here, and oh gosh, I'm not sure who else is.
Well, I can fill in on that part of that. So locally, Kalamazoo Nonviolent Opponents of War, KNOW, has been involved with this project and is providing support for it. And so, and again, this is exactly the kind of thing Kalamazoo Nonviolent Opponents of War has been doing. That group formed back in 2002 to oppose the impending invasion of Iraq at that time. And even after the invasion took place in 2003, KNOW stayed together as an anti-war organization in Kalamazoo. And over the years, we've taken on a lot of different projects, but one of the major projects that we've tried to deal with is focusing attention on the military budget and the devastating impact that, well, and again, if you add in all military spending, as you guys probably know, it ends up being over $1 trillion a year. It's not just the Pentagon budget, that's bad enough, but then money for nuclear weapons is hidden in the Department of Energy budget, and there's a lot of other military spending in there. It ends up being well over $1 trillion, as William Hartig has analyzed. So it has such a huge impact, and we've talked about again how that deprives resources from other important projects that need to go on. And so KNOW has been at the forefront of trying to advocate on these issues. And so if there are people who, again, if they see this too late to come out this weekend to the events or next Monday for the teach-in, could still contact KNOW and either Don or me. We've both been involved. Daniel Smith, our producer and director here at the program, are all members of KNOW. And so again, we certainly welcome people's participation. And I think visits like yours give a spur to the local groups, right? Give us a little jolt, right? It's hard work. It's hard work to be involved in this, and we're so far away from achieving our goal, as Denise, as you said, right? So there's still a lot to be done, and I think the Golden Rule Peace Boat project, as it arrives in communities, gives the local activists a little jolt, and that's what you've been emphasizing a lot today. So what other kinds of projects, we only have a couple of minutes left, but what other kinds of projects are you folks involved with or would like to highlight or spotlight?
Well, I'm involved with Clean Up the Mines, which is a group that works with indigenous peoples in the Navajo Nation and the Lakota Sioux Nation to clean up abandoned uranium mines. There's 15,000 of them. That would be a lot of good work for people. And of course, Veterans for Peace, as well as the Golden Rule Project, are the main things that I'm working on. But, you know, just to be clear, it's not just nuclear weapons. It's everything to do with the uranium pathway, all the way from mining the uranium, milling it, the processing of it, which has produced contamination in Piketon, Ohio, and Paducah, Kentucky, for example, where the centrifuging takes place to separate the isotopes, all the way to there is no place to put them. So from cradle to grave, nuclear everything is a problem. And in your area, you're right between two nuclear power plants. And people are working really hard to get those decommissioned properly so that we don't have companies that come in and take the $1 billion decommissioning fund and say, oh, now I've got a little LLC and they're the ones that own that power plant and are responsible. I've got the $1 billion. They don't have anything. Ratepayers, you got to pony up another $1 billion in order to get this cleanup done. And they don't even do it right.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm looking for a different solution than some powerful contractor that maybe is the only kid on the block to do the decommissioning work. So that's something I'm involved with.
Denise, real quick, we only got a minute left.
We're going to keep getting resolutions passed in towns and cities and states and counties throughout the country. We're going to try to get a U.S. Descendant Observer to the second meeting of state parties for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We're going to build support with local and state elected officials as well. And you know, and we're going to get more co-sponsors on HRS 77 and build some champions for nuclear disarmament in Congress.
Don, City Kalamazoo is probably going to get involved and
Well,
give
they're
us
coming to my class on Monday and maybe on Wednesday, and I'm sure we could mobilize students around these issues.
I think we do that.
Yeah.
We build a power in Kalamazoo, and then we come
Join
and
them with-
talk to the vice mayor and see if we
Yeah,
can get a
we-
resolution adopted.
The vice mayor's willing to do it, but unfortunately, I'm not the czar, you know,
Right.
there's a difference.
Yeah.
But we can do that. We could do that in this city, and working with NO and with the other groups around, I think this is great, that we could really raise consciousness in this community. This community has a history of taking a lead on social justice issues. We were the 6th university in the country to divest from South Africa, and we worked on that issue for almost 20 years, and so we can take a lead on this.
Excellent.
And just a quick shout out to Kevin Camps and Beyond Nuclear.
Yes.
And again, you
Yes.
mentioned the full range of issues concerning nuclear weapons and nuclear power. Kevin's been hard at work on that, and that will be part of the discussion that's going to go on the next couple of days here. Thank you both for being here, for participating with us
for
on critical
inviting us.
issues.
This was wonderful.
It's just great to have you. Thank you for visiting us on critical issues, alternative views. We'll see you again next time. Thank you.